started.
Okay.
Thank you guys. I'm excited that you all are here. Welcome to our last installment of the Hard Earth series of talks. For those who don't know me, my name is Andrew Santa. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and I work on sustainability in the built environment. So as someone interested in sustainability, it's been a great pleasure to sort of facilitate this series of talks as they've gone on throughout the quarter. And with that, I'll introduce our final speaker for this series of talks. Jeff Ball is not a graduate student. We've had graduate students so far. Jeff is not. Jeff is a scholar in residence at the Stanford Law School, where he works and writes about on things related to the environment and sustainability. Jeff came to Stanford in 2011 from the Wall Street Journal, where he was the editor of the environment section and columnist and reporter writing about things related to the environment and sustainability. Jeff has much experience speaking and moderating discussions on things in this field of study, and he'll have some great things to say for everyone here tonight. Tonight, Jeff will talk about. Jeff will speak about the challenges of achieving and working toward climate solutions in the political sphere, in the political environment, and sort of how the climate fight is changing and will change given the results of the latest presidential election. So please join me in welcoming Jeff Ball.
Thank you, Andrew. I want to say thank you first to Andrew because in addition to writing about this stuff, I live 10 feet from this room with Becky, who's right there. Becky and I are for the who does not live in Roble, who's here. So thank you. And are you guys in Andrew's class? Excellent. Well, thanks for me. So we're what they call resident fellows in Roble, and the Hard Earth series came out of an idea that is kind of wending its way through this dorm, which is called the Roble Living Laboratory for Sustainability at Stanford. And the notion is to do a whole suite of things having to do with sustainability and make this place a focal point for that. And one of the ideas was to have this series, and so this series will continue in the winter and the spring terms. And each of these terms has 4 graduate student speakers and then 1 non-graduate student speaker. So it occurred to us that given the results of the election, which I remember watching with about 150 people in this room about 3 weeks ago, something like that, 4 weeks ago. It'd be worth talking about the impact of that on a lot of the issues that you all have been talking about. So. What I'm going to do is talk for maybe 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. I hate slides because I think they're a crutch, but I'm going to show you a bunch of them because I don't know a way to communicate some really, what seems to me to be important statistical information really quickly. I'm going to show them to you really quickly, and you're not going to understand them all, or they're going to hopefully scratch itches, and they're going to confuse you, or at least pique some interest, and then we can go back and talk about whatever you want to talk about. But I think, frankly, the discussion is going to be much more interesting than my sitting here and preaching. So that's the goal. So let me start by kind of sketching out an aspiration here. The notion behind this whole Hard Earth series was to talk about tough environmental dilemmas. If this stuff were easy, no one would need to sit here and listen. And it's not easy. And I suspect, as a spectator in a lot of these talks, I've left with a lot more questions than I have had answers, and I think you're going to leave that way this evening too, which I think is in the spirit of this whole enterprise. I want to say one other thing about the election. You can love Donald Trump, you can hate Donald Trump, and I don't really care. To me, the most important thing about this election, the most striking thing about this election is the extent to which it surprised everyone. And I think the extent, I was just in Mexico last week talking with a bunch of university students for a week, and almost to a person they were trying to make sense of this. And I think it says something really profound that in 2016, when we ostensibly have the most advanced technology, we're all on our phones, we all assume that we know everything about everyone, we can get in a metal tube and be anywhere in the world in 15 hours, that everyone was surprised by who was elected president of the largest economy in the world. And I think that it says something, I think the fact that everyone was so surprised says something about the extent to which we all live in bubbles. You know, it's kind of, it's in vogue at Stanford to kind of with a smirk talk about the bubble. And it is a bubble, obviously, and Silicon Valley is a bubble, but I think it's not just this bubble. I think everyone lives in bubbles, and I think what this election taught us is that we all live in extraordinarily thick bubbles. And if we're going to solve some of the problems that plague us, we're going to have to pop the bubbles. And to me, that's what being a university is about, and more specifically, that's what being a journalist is about, which is the way I've spent my life. It's popping bubbles that people don't want popped, because often life in the bubble is pretty comfortable. So, why do I pontificate on that? Because I think the whole discussion about climate change is very much a discussion that has occurred in bubbles, and I want to pop some bubbles tonight. Okay, so here we go. Let me just to get us on the same page, let me just read you a few quotes from our president-elect about climate change. So Donald Trump wrote a book in 2015 called Crippled America, How to Make America Great Again. And he criticized this is a quote, the mistaken belief that global climate change is being caused by carbon emissions. He called renewable energy a big mistake. He said it's really just an expensive way of making the tree huggers feel good about themselves. There's a plan for the first 100 days that Donald Trump has on his website that you can go look at. And I'll just give you two quotes from it. He said that he pledges as president to, quote, cancel the Paris Climate Agreement, and we can talk about that if you want, what that is. Cancel the Paris Climate Agreement and stop all payments of US tax dollars to UN global warming programs. And he said that he supports all forms of energy, but not, and that includes nuclear, wind, and solar, but not to the exclusion of other energy. The government should not pick winners and losers. And the last thing I'll quote to you is from an interview that he did, a fairly extensive interview that he did with New York Times about a week ago. As for the cause of climate change, he said the following: you can make lots of cases for different views, end of quote, as to the relationship between human activity and climate change. He said, I have a totally open mind, and then he said, I think there is some connectivity, there is something. It depends on how much. This is connectivity between human action and climate change. It also depends on how much it's going to cost our companies. You have to understand our companies are non-competitive right now, non-competitive in the global context. And then he talked about renewable energy, and he said the following with regard to wind turbines in particular. I don't think they work at all without massive subsidy. I wouldn't want to subsidize it. Okay, end of quote on Donald Trump. Now, I don't think that surprised any of you, but I just want to sort of, I want to have us all understand the clarity with which he talked about these things. And then yesterday, you may know that Donald Trump announced his pick for the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, someone named Scott Pruitt, who's Attorney General of Oklahoma. Mr. Pruitt was one of 28 attorneys general in states that have led a lawsuit against the Environmental Protection Agency to fight something called the Clean Power Plan, which very simplistically put is an effort to reduce carbon emissions from power plants in the United States, particularly coal-fired power plants, and has been a key to the Obama administration's climate plan. He has called himself proudly a leading advocate against the EPA's activist agenda, and he said the following about climate change in a piece he wrote in a magazine earlier this year. He said, scientists continue to disagree about the degree and extent of global warming and its connections to the actions of mankind. That debate should be encouraged in classrooms, public forums, and the halls of Congress. It should not be silenced with threats of prosecution. Dissent is not a crime. Okay, so enough quoting. Let's just step back for a second and think for a minute about where we are with climate change. So it is clear that the Earth is warming. It is clear that human activity is related to that warming. And there are things that are really not clear. And I'm going to go really quickly through this stuff, and we can come back and talk about whatever you want to talk about. One of the things that's not clear is the way that climate change is going to manifest itself, particularly on the local level. So if you hear anyone tell you what Palo Alto is going to be like in 20 years as a result of climate change, you should raise your eyebrows. That is not to say that it's not clear that things are going to happen, but it's very, very unclear exactly what's going to happen and where. And that's going to be relevant for a reason that we're going to get to in a moment. Okay, now, where are we in dealing with climate change? So, in some respects, we're making progress. In 2015 was the second consecutive year when global GDP, that is the global economy, grew although emissions were effectively flat. CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions were effectively flat. Now I'll show a chart in a moment, but what you should understand is that since the Industrial Revolution, economic growth has been a function of burning fossil fuels, and burning fossil fuels emits carbon dioxide. So the potential for what the wonks call a decoupling of economic growth and carbon dioxide emissions is fairly extraordinary. Now, it's only been 2 years. We don't know whether that trend continues, but that's an interesting possibility for a significant turn. And then there was something called the Paris Climate Conference. Who's heard of the Paris Climate Conference, which took place about a year ago? So I'm going to read you 2 statistics from the Paris Climate Conference. Basically, what happened in Paris was that nations around the world came and they pledged that they would do certain things on climate change. And what was significant here was that it was not just the developed countries of the world, it was developing countries of the world as well, who heretofore had not been asked to make pledges to reduce their emissions. Although, as we'll see, developing countries are the lion's share of emissions growth going forward. And so, I won't spare you the statistics, but China, the world's largest emitter, made pledges that were widely viewed as aggressive. The United States made pledges that were widely viewed as aggressive. And then I want to show you a couple of slides. So, baked into, so those pledges in Paris are baked into certain assumptions about where the world is going. This is something from something called the International Energy Agency. Has anyone heard of the IEA? So the International Energy Agency is basically conventional wisdom on where global energy goes. And this is effectively now, 2014. There's something weird about this, right? It's all a little smushed. In any event, this is now, and this is 25 years from now. And we'll go through this really quickly. This is the world, just electricity. This doesn't take into account transportation. It doesn't take into account heat, for instance, from industry. But anyway, in terms of electricity, so what do you notice about this? We'll spend 2 minutes on this chart. What do you notice about where we are and where the projections are of where we will go?
Coal's a humongous portion of the energy.
Now or in the future?
Right now.
Right now. And in the future, it's not nothing, right? Okay, what else do you notice?
Gas increases.
Gas. So this is not gasoline that you put in your car. This is natural gas, which is burned, comes out of the ground like oil does, and it's burned to produce electricity. So here's what I notice. Coal, gas, and oil are what are called fossil fuels. And you see that coal, gas, and oil are now, effectively 60-something% of electricity generation. And they shrink, but they remain the majority. Okay? Nuclear basically stays flat. Nuclear in climate terms is wonderful. You may have other problems with nuclear environmentally in terms of waste, but it doesn't emit carbon, and so in climate terms it's a good thing. Hydro, dams, effectively stays flat, actually stays flat. So here's the change. So fossil fuel squeezes, contracts, and where does the additional generation come from? Wind goes from 3% to 9%, and solar goes from 1% to 5%. Now, those are still small slices of the pie, but that's an extraordinary growth. And the other thing that this slide doesn't show you is that the pie itself grows, because total global energy consumption is going to increase a lot. So, I would submit to you that this and this, going from here to there, is itself a revolution. Now, the question is, how much of a revolution? It's certainly a revolution economically. I spend a lot of my time talking to people and writing about people who are trying to make money in those two spheres. We're going to get to the question of to what extent it's a revolution in terms of climate. It's sufficient in terms of climate. Okay. So, here is that. Those two pie charts assume certain policies that are in effect now, but that haven't fully revealed themselves. Things like what Obama did with the Clean Power Plan. So this is sort of the United States, how the United States would change. We were looking at global numbers. It's how the United States would change under what the IEA calls a new policy scenario, certain policies that have already been promulgated. And again, what do you see? You see, I mean, this is another way of looking at it. To me, fairly significant. What do you see about coal? Goes down, right? And you see renewables go up a lot. And so that's fair enough. Now, here's what this blue line is CO2 emissions. So CO2, we're right here, right? CO2 emissions were going up and they've started to come down. Again, this is the potential decoupling of the economy that we're talking about, and we will see, let's just be clear, that from here outward is a projection of the future. It hasn't happened, right? So we don't know whether the line keeps going down or whether the line goes up. All right, now. Okay, now, here we come to the challenge for the world. So everyone came to Paris and they proffered these pledges, and the press wrote that it was wonderful, it was a new day in terms of fighting climate change. So, has anyone seen a chart like this before? Andrew has, no surprise. Has anyone else seen? Okay, so this is climate change in 30 seconds. If you want to, when we get to the question and answer, I'm happy to explain kind of what the phenomenon of climate change is. But here's the issue. So these are global carbon dioxide emissions. They've been going up. We're here. In fact, there was a dip. Anyone know why they dipped at this point? Look at the year when they dipped and give some assessment of why they might have dipped.
Is it the recession?
There was a recession. And again, we talked about again, I don't want to be, I'm not trying to be condescending, right? But the economy slowed. When the economy slows, energy consumption slows, so emissions go down. And then the economy picks up and emissions go up. Okay, so here's where we are. The red line is business as usual. If we kind of do what we're doing, that's what will happen to emissions. Remember I showed you those two pie charts, and there was an increase in solar and wind, and a decrease in coal and gas? That's if certain policies are implemented that are on the books now, and if they're kept on the books and certain additional ones are added. Okay, so this is no sure thing. Okay, but this is what we were looking at, which I suggested to you is itself something of a revolution. But folks, that's not enough. So if the world is going to do what scientists tell us the world needs to do to address climate change meaningfully, we have to do not this, and not this, but this. And what I'll suggest to you is, if we do this, your lives will be different. What you wear will be different, what you fly will be different, how often you fly will be different, what you eat will be different, the kind of building you live in will be different. So this is not just an academic question. There is absolutely no precedent for us doing this, for our doing this. It's not clear that we're going to be doing this, but I just want to understand kind of the extent to which this is a radical notion, which is not to say we shouldn't do it, but there's no suggestion that we're on that path now. Okay. Now, two more quick slides on what that would mean. It ain't about America. So we talked about Donald Trump, and there's this consternation about whether the United States, consternation among people who think a lot about climate change as to whether the United States is going to abrogate its promises, particularly promises that it made in Paris. So just take a second and look at this chart. And again, we are effectively right here, right? So this has happened, and these are projections. And these are this is growth in energy demand. And again, we've established that at least historically, energy demand means carbon emissions, right? So what do you see, what do you notice about this? You have 30 seconds. Yeah.
The developing countries are the ones that are growing.
Yeah, that's right. So if we think about where energy growth is coming from in the world, and therefore where emissions growth is coming from in the world, this is not, so the United States isn't broken out, but it's obviously part of North America. In fact, you can't see my shadow, but what do you actually see? You see actually energy demand is going to be declining in the United States. That is, we're mature economies and our energy demand is going to be peaking. And we can talk about why that might be, because our population is still going to grow a little bit. We're getting essentially more efficient as an economy. Same thing with the European Union, same thing with Japan and Korea. And then we get to the developing world. And of course, there's China, there's India, and then you get to the rest of Southeast Asia and Africa, and other includes to a large extent Latin America. So the point is, we can do wonderful things in the United States or not do wonderful things in the United States, and it is going to matter diminishingly. What's going to matter now? There may be a question as to the extent to which what we do in the United States influences other countries, and we can talk about that. But the point is, I think it's really important that we not be parochial here and get so caught up in the presidential politics around climate change that we delude ourselves into thinking that if we only did certain things in this country, the problem would be solved. It would not be solved, and it will be less and less solved given this. Clear? Okay. So, again, just another way of looking at this. To me, this is even more striking. If the world, remember those lines? There was red, blue, was it red, blue, green? Red is what we're doing, blue is sort of where we say we want to go, or where we may go, and then green is the really radical move. So this is, if we were going to go from blue to green. So we're going here, if we were going to go here, but if we're not going to do this, we're going to do this. Who would have to do the lifting? Again, what do you see? It's China and India and the rest of the developing world that have to do the heavy lifting. So this is really, really important when we start to talk about the geopolitics of climate change. Okay? All right. Let me turn, Andrew, do I turn, is it the right button or the left button?
The right button.
The right button. All right, so, actually, let's just go straight to the next ones. So, I have heard on this campus in the wake of the election a lot of consternation about Donald Trump's election. And I've heard that among people who care about climate change in the context of climate change. So the notion seems to be, what a travesty that someone was elected who says what Donald Trump says about climate change, given what we all know to be true. We, the enlightened on this campus, and therefore presumably what sort of the world thinks. So I told you I wanted to burst some bubbles. So this is not my numbers. I'm going to throw some polling information at you. And what I hope you're going to conclude from this is that things are not as pat as you would have thought they were in terms of public opinion. And they may be even more complicated than you thought. So really quickly, and we'll come back. This is from something called the Pew Research Center. So this is a fairly reputable organization in Washington. And what do you notice about, I'm not going to repeat everything on the chart, what do you notice? The United States and China are the two largest emitters in the world of carbon dioxide. And what do you notice about public opinion there? They're also effectively, well, the United States certainly is the richest or among the richest countries in the world. China is getting wealthier. What do you notice about those two countries compared to the others?
They seem to be way less.
Yeah, and why might that be? So isn't that kind of interesting that the two countries that are contributing the most to carbon emissions demonstrate the lowest concern about the impact of those carbon emissions, at least among major geographies? Why might that be? Well, you know what, we'll come back to that, but let's just establish that that's what was found to be the case in terms of public opinion. Now, this is from a UN poll. I apologize, I don't have very good PowerPoint skills, so forgive me this stuff, which shouldn't be on here. But this is a global poll by the United Nations about what people declare to be their concerns, their big concerns in the world. Where do you find climate change? And what's climate change under? Phone and internet access. Now, I promise you I didn't lop off the chart. I didn't gerrymander these things. This is actually what it says. So I just want you to understand where things are. And you want me to leave this up here, or can we go on? Can we go on? Okay. This is global. Now, this is from another, and that's from the UN. This is from another Pew poll. And by the way, if you're interested in this stuff, I highly commend the Pew, and Gallup does really interesting polling too. Just Google them or email me and I'll send them to you. So this is, as you can see, this is the partisan divide in the United States between professed concern or professed the belief that the Earth is warming because of human activity. And this is for the past 10 years. And tell me what strikes you about this chart, this graph. Please.
The Democrat and the Republican graphs have similar shapes.
Good.
So like drops in public opinion might be correlated between them.
Excellent. So first of all, there's clearly a partisan divide, right? I dare say no one in this room is surprised by the fact that Democrats, given the platforms of the parties, that the Democrats are expressing more concern. I don't think that's a big surprise to anyone here. But I agree with you. I think that's a really interesting, they track. So we could spend a lot of time analyzing why professed concern goes down and up. Anything else? Well, let me just elaborate on that. I think it's really interesting that the gap is doing, if it's changing in any way, it's getting wider. Right? So, why is that interesting? What might you think, if an issue were perceived as hugely important, wouldn't you think that there might be a closing of that gap? Right? Okay. So, let's stop there. Andrew, do I turn the right one off? I hit the right one to turn it off? Okay, so I want to pause here for a second. So why, I'm going to posit here that what we're seeing is that people don't really care in a broad sense about this issue. So why don't people care about it? Or why don't they care more than they do?
Maybe because the feedback loop in your direct lives is like it's a lot longer, further away than some of the other things that are impacting you. Like you can't see the direct impact of it like
Exactly.
in your face every single day.
Right, I think that's really, really, really important. Anything else? Yeah.
I don't know how big a portion of the population this is, but like anyone who works in an industry that's in a job related to the fossil fuel industry at all probably doesn't want to be told that like the thing that makes them a living is harmful and they have to stop.
Yeah.
Like Hillary Clinton on the campaign trail saying she's gonna like put coal workers out of business.
Right.
It definitely didn't help her out.
Right. Okay. Good. So economic interest, perceived economic interest. What else? So anything else? Yeah, please.
There's also kind of like a lack of any sort of personal incentive whatsoever beyond kind of like feeling like you're doing the right thing in most cases.
Say more about that. Why is there a lack of personal incentive?
Well, it's a combination of the factors we just talked about. One is that there's no immediate feedback loop for you to even concretely say, oh, I did this,
Yep.
make this change, but also oftentimes making more sustainable choices, sometimes making more sustainable choices is more costly in some other ways.
Yeah, exactly. So you've already answered it, but let me just try to develop a little more. I think that climate change is bar none the most difficult environmental issue the world has ever faced. And what I'm going to suggest to you is actually that the people on these charts who demonstrate less concern than perhaps you might feel or you might wish they demonstrated are actually being very rational. And that in the context of that, Donald Trump is actually being very rational. You may agree with him and you may disagree with him, but he's not a total outlier if he looks at these polls. And so I'm not sure how far we get kind of talking about what we like or not like politically, but let's talk a little more about climate change in the context of environmental issues. So why is it so complicated? It's complicated because the causes are so broad. That is, burning fossil fuel is something that happens in every aspect of our life. It's complicated in terms of the solutions being so disparate. That is, in the case of smog, for instance, the stuff that you can see in the air, we know how to solve that. We turn off some factories and we change tailpipe filters on cars and we solve that. But solving climate change is infinitely more difficult, in part because it's global, right? We can solve smog locally, but even if we solve smog locally, we still have the emissions of carbon dioxide creating kind of a planetary blanket. And so if we succeed in Los Angeles or in San Francisco in addressing smog, and that has some ancillary benefit in terms of climate emissions, that does effectively nothing for the world unless lots of other jurisdictions do the same thing. So it's global warming. But let's go back to what I think is the toughest issue, which is what we've just talked about here, which is the public perception issue. So when you see, well, climate doesn't strike us as a crisis because it moves slowly. Has anyone in this room seen climate change? Has anyone in this room seen water pollution? Yeah, or at least pictures of it. Maybe you've seen pictures of climate change. You've seen glacier melting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen smog? Yeah. But you haven't seen climate change. And that's really, that makes it extraordinarily difficult to deal with. And I think the kind of cleanest way to say this is that it's hard to see climate change as a crisis when it's pretty easy to see other kinds of environmental issues as a crisis. So, how do I turn this on? So this is, I forgot this one. This is sort of interesting. This is Pew. This is gender, race, age, education, partisanship on climate. And I'll just tell you very quickly one thing that strikes me: an extraordinarily wide racial divide, and not so wide an age divide. So I think there's a kind of lore, particularly on this campus, that somehow young people are much more concerned about climate change than others. This doesn't really bear that out. I'm not sure that bodes very well for changing this notion that we all think this is a crisis and that we're going to do something about it. Okay, so who's been to Shanghai? Who's been to China? So this is a picture I took outside my hotel window in downtown Shanghai, in Pudong, on the east side of the river. And some of that is reflection from glass from my hotel room, but most of it's not. Most of it's smog, right? And that's the kind of smog that you can chew when you walk down the sidewalk. So that's a picture I took walking around Beijing. And this is not because of the guy smoking a cigarette. Look at what the woman's wearing. So one of the things that was most striking to me on my first trips to China, I happen to go to China decently often for my work, is that you can see face masks that are striped, or that are Snoopy, or that are plaid, or that are Mickey Mouse, right? And it says something about a society when a face mask becomes a fashion symbol. Pretty profound. When people regard a face mask as kind of a fashion symbol like they do Nikes. That's me. That's me taking a selfie on the subway in Beijing, and that was a day when the particulate matter, PM 2.5, by the way, PM 2.5 is a term describing the size of particulates in the air, and anyone who spends a lot of time in China here probably has an app on his or her phone that traces the PM 2.5 levels in the cities in China. There was a whole political fight in China because the US Embassy began propagating this information, and the Chinese government initially wasn't too happy about it, but the levels of PM 2.5 have been up to 40 times the levels that the World Health Organization defines as problematic. So I happened to be there typically worse in the winter, and I was there on a trip, and one day I actually went to talk to people at an environmental organization, and they said you really shouldn't be outside without a mask. So they gave me the mask, and I'll tell you, I felt really self-conscious about wearing the mask. And then I put the mask on, and it's sort of the frog in the boiling water syndrome. Do you know what that means? Where you drop a frog in boiling water, and the frog jumps out. But if you put the frog in cold water and you slowly turn up the heat in the water, the frog doesn't know what's happening to it. So to me, walking around Beijing with nothing over my mouth is like sort of being in cool water where the temperature is being turned up. And then I put this on, and then I have it on for an hour, and then I take it off, and then I can smell what I was breathing. And that's sort of like the frog in the boiling water. So I will tell you, why do I say all this? Because this is a crisis. You don't have to tell anyone in Beijing or Shanghai or many other cities in China that this is a crisis. This is not just an environmental crisis, this is a public health crisis. And you don't have to tell anyone in government offices in Beijing that this is a crisis. Because this is the stuff of which political revolutions are made. And so that is why Beijing is dealing with this. So China is dealing with smog in much the same way that Los Angeles dealt with smog 40 years ago. So none of you is old enough, but if you go and read the history books, the air in Los Angeles looked not unlike the air in Beijing looks about 40 years ago in Los Angeles. And what happened was that people in Los Angeles essentially decided that this was not acceptable. It was not befitting a city in an industrialized country for people to be dying of respiratory problems, for little Johnny to be coughing. And so a whole series of things happened that had policy implications, and we changed the air in Los Angeles. You remember I said that smog is relatively easy to deal with because it's a local problem? I don't have much doubt that Beijing and Chinese cities more broadly will deal with their smog problems. And then I'm going to stop and we'll talk. But the really, really difficult thing about climate change is that even though dealing with smog has some effect on the emissions that cause climate change, even if Beijing and China more broadly got rid of all that smog, that would not have a palpable effect on global carbon dioxide emissions. So The problem is that dealing with what we all perceive to be environmental crises, palpable crises about which we do not disagree, will not get us far enough to deal with climate change. Does that make sense? And so here's where I'm going to end. The history of dealing with environmental problems is largely about dealing with pushes. We come up against a problem that we see as absolutely necessary to deal with, like smog, and we do it. And there are all sorts of other examples. France gets most of its energy today from nuclear energy. Why? Because France faced an oil embargo in 1973, and France got most of its electricity from oil, and France decided it was not going to allow its economy to come to a screeching halt, and so it shifted to nuclear energy in one of the, again, extraordinarily contentious in France, but one of the greatest shifts in energy in human history. But the problem is that we don't feel the crisis with climate change. And it's entirely possible that we won't do what we need to do, the scientists tell us, until it's too late. So, it seems to me that one of the most important ways that we confront climate change is not in the push that we've used thus far to deal with environmental problems, but rather the notion of a pull. So, can technologies that produce energy much more cleanly than the ones that we've used thus far get to a point where we want them for reasons other than their climate benefit? Does that make sense? Can solar and wind, can energy efficiency get so cheap that we want them for other reasons? And that's, I think, unanswerable at this point, but it's what a lot of people in Silicon Valley are working at. And it seems to me that if that doesn't happen, there's no way we're going to deal with climate change, because the push has not worked. So I'm going to stop. I hope that's been a little bit interesting. And we can talk about whatever you want to talk about. Thanks. And we can also have cupcakes. I will pass out cupcakes as you can come up and grab one or a couple. Anyone have any questions about anything we talked about? Yeah, please.
Yes, one question I had, so like, in something I was reading, it was talking about sort of similar to what you said, how a lot of these huge environmental issues like climate change that we can't tangibly see are like hyper objects that are like difficult to grasp and deal with. So how do you think we can make people, other than pull factors, I guess,
Other than what?
other than like hoping that energy becomes a pull factor for
Yeah.
changing climate
Yeah.
behavior, do you think there's a way to change public opinion that climate change is important when it's so difficult to grasp it?
I have a thought, but does anyone else have a thought? I think there's been a lot of effort to do that. I think that's essentially been the agenda of a lot of big environmental organizations in this country and around the world. I don't think it's worked. Because I think if it had worked, you'd see different poll numbers. I think when you have to scream and yell and shake people upside the head and tell them it's really a crisis, they don't believe it's a crisis. And so when you see dips in emissions, those dips in emissions don't happen because suddenly people internalize the notion that climate change is a problem. They happen because of broader economic forces. So I don't see much evidence that the attempt to convince people that there's a push is bearing much fruit. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Andrew?
I thought one of your graphs had to do with like which countries think, or which areas, geographic regions think climate change is a real problem. And something that stood out to me was that the two areas that actually did think it was a problem were, I think, Africa and Latin and South America.
Very interesting, yeah.
Like scientists are like,
I'll pass these around.
we have been told that those are areas that will actually feel the effects of climate change
Yes.
more than other areas.
Yep.
And so maybe that's, I mean, maybe there's hope there in that, like some of these places that are developing, who will eventually transition to more developed economies and use more energy, if they're aware of the problem a little bit more than places like China and the United States, then maybe that's a good sign.
Yeah, anyone want to say anything about that? I think to me that's another fascinating part of that chart.
Yeah.
And we don't need to look at my face for another 10 minutes. So look, there are, one of the things that I think has been really interesting about the past 5 years is that the world has started to see effects of climate change in a much more palpable way than it had before. So we are starting to get to a point where people actually may start to see this stuff. So I'll give you a couple of examples. They're scientists, in addition to watching melting and which raises concerns about sea level rise, are seeing changes in insect patterns. Anyone know about this? Right? Insects are moving as a result of warming temperatures. And when insects move, that has an effect on agriculture. And so the potential exists that this becomes, there are farmers who are saying that they're actually starting to see different crop yields as a result of this. So in fact, if you're a more agrarian society and you're starting to see this, that might explain one reason that there's more professed concern. There's another reason too, which is that we're a rich country, and to the extent that we see effects of climate change here, we can better deal with them than other places can. So if the waters start to rise in lower Manhattan, so in fact, you can go look this up, there have been task forces that have already started to game out what lower Manhattan will do in the event of more intense sea level rise. And the point is lower Manhattan can afford to build seawalls and do other things that it needs to do. But if you live in a country that can't afford to, then it's likelier that you're going to profess concern about this, not just because climate change is then not just an esoteric issue, it actually has the potential to affect you much more directly. Other questions? Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. I think because global warming seems like such like a global problem that needs every single person involved, and like I think a lot of what people feel urged to do when they hear about this is like inform people, right, and spread that that information that will make people consciously more aware of the impact and like really understand that deeply. But instead of that route of fighting climate change, people who already kind of understand the impacts of climate change who just focus on like altering businesses and economies so that the financial gain goes in the right direction of climate change instead.
Yeah, I have a thought, but I'm interested in your thoughts too. Does anyone else have a thought? So this is basically, the question is, do you scream from the rooftop and try to convince people that they need to do something about climate change? Or perhaps differently, perhaps not differently, do you somehow render it easier for people to make money by doing kind of the right environmental thing? Is that basically the question?
Yeah.
Anyone have an idea about this? There are a lot of people on this campus who have thoughts on this because they're actually spending their days in one of those areas. A couple people's hands went up. Yeah.
I feel like in general people are motivated by making money or saving money, so economic incentives are always the best.
Uh-huh. Good. Did you hear that?
Well, I did. I was gonna say like around the same thing, but it's like when they charge for like plastic bags, like people are like, oh, okay, I'll bring that in.
I'll do it now.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm here to suggest to you that money is good. And that the notion that there's somehow a conflict between the economy and the environment is a naive notion. That the only way that environmental problems have been solved on a grand scale, I think history shows, is when the economy has been put in the service of the environment. So the question to me is not sort of, is money bad for the environment? The question is, how might the profit motive be harnessed for the good of the environment rather than harnessed to create environmental problems? And so, look, so I think where I'm going with this is that it's not an either or. That what happens typically to change the profit motive toward a more environmental bent is that policies change, right? And we can talk in a second very briefly about some of those policies, but how do policies change? Policies change because there's political pressure to change policies, right? So, you've heard about a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. That is the notion of putting a price on carbon emissions, taxing effectively the emission of carbon dioxide, so people have an incentive to emit less carbon dioxide. There are all sorts of ways to do it. That's essentially creating an economic disincentive to do what you don't want people to do. The flip side of that is to subsidize what you do want people to do, and we do that in this country. We have quite large tax credits for solar energy, for instance. there is, this is another hour-long discussion, but I would submit to you that the way that the world has gone about incentivizing more environmentally friendly energy has been dumb. That's the technical term, stupid. Which is not to say that the endeavor of shifting to cleaner forms of energy is dumb. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we've been pretty profligate about it. We have not been very disciplined about the way that we've incentivized this. And that's maybe okay when what this is for politicians is effectively part of the marketing budget. That is, we're going to throw a little money, throw some money at the wall to look green so we get some votes, or for a company, we're going to throw some money against the wall and it's effectively part of our PR budget, and we don't care if it actually makes us money. But I would argue that that is not the kind of effort that is going to scale these technologies up to a point where they're going to make any environmental difference. And so if we are going to propose to scale them up to that point, we need to incentivize this stuff in a way that's much more rigorous, because otherwise we're going to be wasting our money and there's not going to be enough to go around. So there's a lot of really, if any of you is interested in policy, if any of you has aspirations of becoming a lawyer, there are really lucrative careers to be made figuring out, designing better policies to incentivize this stuff. And there's a big fight going on in Washington right now about the extent to which the subsidies, for instance, for solar energy and wind energy ought to be changed. There are a lot of people in Europe which had very generous incentives in this area, who politicians who lost their political shirts because there was a revolt against what was perceived to be unaffordability of these programs. So we're living in this fascinating transition right now, but it's time to be a lot more serious than we've been. Serious not just in saying this is a problem, serious in applying economic rigor to how we deal with the problem. Yeah, please.
Okay, so as far as subsidies go, like, I've sort of read that in the US at least, we subsidize like fossil fuels a lot more than we do clean energy. But then like some politicians talk about how like we need to like, it's unfair that we're giving these subsidies to renewable energy when they're still subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. So like, how big of a barrier is, I mean, like I've heard that one part of the solution is just to like remove subsidies from fossil fuels, like not even incentivize clean energy, but just to make it like fair, so that neither like fossil fuels or like renewable energy gets any subsidies, and then like the market works it out. So why is that like such a, why are there so many obstacles to like just letting the market like decide how much energy and which types of energy are produced? Because it seems like there's so much like of a push towards fossil fuels based on our policy, and like why is it so difficult to remove that and just let sort of like the free market and like capitalism sort of take place?
You have any thought on that? Why it's so difficult to remove it?
Fossil fuel lobby?
Okay, any other further thought?
Well, I mean, isn't it the case that our infrastructure up to now is pretty much based on and built around that, so when making that isn't as easy as just
All of that. So let me take, Andrew, shut me up when you need to shut me up, which is probably 5 minutes ago, right?
Well, yeah, if you have to leave, feel free.
So let me
If
take
you
a
wanna
stab at this. First of all, let me push back a little bit on the characterization of fossil fuel versus clean energy, because I think terms here are really important. There are variations in the cleanliness of different fossil fuels. So coal is much dirtier in many ways, including in a carbon way, than, for instance, natural gas. So there are many environmental groups that are advocating for a continued shift from coal to natural gas, because every bit of natural gas, every bit of electricity that you produce from natural gas produces about half as much carbon dioxide as every bit that you produce from coal. So fossil fuel is not fossil fuel. Does that make sense? That's number one. Number two, when you try to quantify subsidies, it's like peeling a really big onion. So let's just think about subsidies for oil and gas. So there are certain actual subsidies on the books having to do with one is accelerated depreciation. That is the rate at which you can depreciate off your books as an oil and gas company the cost of the equipment that you buy. There are a number of those things having to do with drilling. Those are pretty clearly subsidies, although there are people in the oil and gas industry who would say that they would define it differently. You won't be surprised. But let's sort of peel the onion deeper. What about the mortgage tax deduction on the purchase of a house in the United States? So many of you, when you get out of here, will end up buying a house. And when you pay taxes, you will be able to deduct interest that you pay on your mortgage. Now, why might that be related to fossil fuel subsidies? Because the pattern of development in this country has been outward and outward and outward based on automotive use, right? You drive to the suburbs and you get a house. So to the extent that the purchase of houses in the suburbs are made less expensive by tax policy, seems to me that that's arguably a subsidy. Let's go out even further. What about public spending on roads, right? Which makes it easier to live a lifestyle that depends on cars, which up until now, and even including now, are overwhelmingly powered by fossil fuels, right? So the point is, we live in a society, every bit of which is predicated on the consumption of fossil fuels. And so I think that if you're being liberal in your definition of subsidy, you can find evidence of that everywhere. Now, there are studies that show that renewable energy for every slug of energy is actually subsidized more than fossil fuel. Now, there are people, and I'm happy to cite chapter and verse if you'd like, but there are really interesting studies that look at that. The retort to that is, renewable energy is at a much earlier point of its development, so the costs are much higher, so it would stand to reason that you'd subsidize it if you want it at a greater percentage. And second of all, given that renewable energy is much smaller than fossil fuel, the amount of total money that the government is spending on these subsidies is smaller. However, I don't think that that gives renewable energy a pass in terms of profligate, wasteful subsidies. So as these things, there are politicians who call for phasing out subsidies of all sorts for energy. I think that's a wonderful notion and concept. I think it's utterly unworkable politically. I just cannot imagine, there's no society in the world that doesn't have energy subsidies. Yeah, I just don't think it's going to happen.
But so the energy subsidies, they're supposed to like make energy cheaper in general, like for.
So there are, this is really, so there are great PhD theses to be written about energy subsidies if this is interesting to you. And I'm happy to talk more about it when we have more time. But there are subsidies that go to producers of energy. So there are subsidies that go to oil and gas companies, there are subsidies that go to solar companies, there are subsidies that go to automakers. And then there's a whole raft of subsidies that go to consumers. So that's less the case here. It's often the case in developing countries that produce a lot of oil. So has anyone been to Saudi Arabia? What does gasoline cost in Saudi Arabia?
That's not bottled water.
50 cents, effectively 50 cents a gallon, because it's subsidized. Because there's a calculation that if gasoline were sold at market rates, there would be a revolution in the streets. And in many, many developing countries, the consumption of energy is heavily subsidized. Now, I'll give you just one more mind bender. Who's been to Europe? Who's rented a car in Europe? So what does gasoline cost in Europe? I mean, what's a range? $8 to $10 a gallon. And gasoline costs, we bitch and moan in this country when gasoline gets to $3 or $4 a gallon. We're in California, so it's more expensive here. So why does gasoline cost twice as much or more in Europe than it costs here? Because it's twice as expensive ground? No.
Transportation,
Same word about transportation.
like transporting oil to that location.
No. So just let's establish, that's a good thought, but it's not right. So oil is a global commodity, right? Oil sells. You can go online and find out what a barrel of oil is trading for today, just like you can find out what an ounce of gold is trading for. There are reasons, though. Something happens to the oil when it's pulled out of the ground and it's refined into gasoline. What happens is taxes. So governments in Europe have decided as a matter of public policy that they want to dissuade people from wasting gasoline. And so they tax a lot. And so that difference between what gasoline, well, there's tax here, but it's much smaller. The difference between what gasoline costs here and what it costs there is all about taxes. So again, that is you could decide that the failure of the government here to tax as heavily as the governments in Europe tax is effectively a subsidy. Does that make sense? It makes the consumption easier. Anyway, it's again, how you define this is all about what results you come out with, but there are huge battles about subsidies. I just don't think it's possible that they're gonna go away. Yes?
I mean, I don't think there's a doubt that people in Beijing or Shanghai or like large polluting cities don't recognize the fact that the air quality is terrible and that like the issue of climate change might be like you said, a crisis. So I was wondering, because like I mean, you should have graphed the charts earlier about how like the public acceptance of the notion of climate change is actually quite low in the U.S. and China, right? So down to what like spatial resolution do you have to go to see a better correlation between locations that produce emissions and people who are concerned about it?
So you're saying how granular can you get, or how granular do you have to get?
Yeah.
How granular do you have to get to find what?
A better correlation, like a positive correlation
Between
polluters and people recognizing that the effect of climate change.
I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question. I mean, it would seem to me actually there might be a negative correlation, which is that if you're producing fossil fuel, you have every incentive not to acknowledge a link because it's an economic hit to acknowledge that link.
Right, but at the same time, like say, especially a lot of like coal mines and factories in China, like the people living in the cities are clearly aware, like they know it's hazardous for them, right?
Well, I guess to me what's important is the distinction between climate change on the one hand and local environmental problems like smog on the other. So let's be very clear. Those statistics did not suggest that there is a lack of concern about the environment in China. And in fact, if we looked at those more specifically, we would actually see higher professed concern about things like clean water. So the distinction is professed concerns about the kinds of environmental problems that you can see and smell and touch, and smog is one of them, and lack of concern about the kinds of environmental problem that you cannot see or smell or touch or feel, which is climate change, right?
Yeah, I think, well, like the interesting question is, because it's like cities versus the world, right? So like on the city level, you can like experience smog and that affects your day-to-day life, but you're not affected by climate change in your day-to-day life. But I think what you were getting at is like how localized does the problem have to get before we actually realize it's a problem? You know what I mean?
Right. I mean, so you see, for instance, in low-lying countries in the Pacific, islands in the Pacific, that claim to be seeing the effects already of rising sea levels, and for whom the notion of migrating away from your home somewhere else is not crazy. There's clearly high professed concern for climate change. And by the way, those are countries that contributed essentially nothing to climate change, right? But what I would say is I think that actually proves the point, which is the reason that there's a professed concern for climate change there is that their climate change is a palpable crisis, or is at least much closer to a palpable crisis, right? It's not professed concern because people's blood runs greener on Pacific Islands. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, Becky.
So, because I was gonna, it kind of plays off of what you were talking about. I was gonna comment on your thing about who has actually witnessed climate change. I had two news items come up in my mind. One is several years ago, the head of the U.S. Coast Guard had to go to Congress and ask for more boats because to patrol around Alaska. And he said, I'm not getting into the debate about climate change. All I know is I've got more water to patrol. And then the other one I think about is that there are communities in South Carolina and Florida who for decades had no flooding, and in the last decade their homes have been flooded 2 or 3 times. And those communities are having to deal, like they're going to Europe to learn how to deal with digging trenches and canals to deal with this flooding that they're seeing. So my point is there are communities now that are already very local communities dealing with the effects of climate